So, recently I made a video wherein I took Skillshare's Instapoetry class. I followed the guidelines provided and wrote my own poem. But, as one of my commenters rightfully pointed out, I kind of cheated by making the poem as long as I wanted it to be. That didn't really fit within the confines of the Instapoetry format. But that got me wondering, is it possible to write a truly good Instapoem? And I don't just mean a good short poem, because obviously that's more than possible, but a good poem that slots into all the typical conventions we think of when it comes to Instapoetry specifically. I reached out to my friend, published poet Danae Younge, to see if this might be possible, but if it was going to be possible, we would need to understand what we're really working with.
All right. So I thought we would look at the origins of the word Instapoetry, which it's called that for two main reasons, as I'm sure you know. The first one being that the meaning is instantly accessible. There's not a lot of rereadability, but it's something that you can read and then scroll. And then the second reason is obviously its associations with Instagram. So it being able to fit on that 3 by 3 screen usually means that it's shorter. The number of lines and the length of the poem is something that I wanted to discuss with you, see if you had any thoughts on that. Because to me, the majority of Insta poems that I've encountered usually fall in the 1 to 8 line range. But I did some sleuthing on Rupi Kaur's Instagram, the queen of Insta poetry herself. And she has a few examples definitely of just a 25 liner just thrown in there where the text is really small. So if you were to ask me, I mean, this is a bit biased, but I'd probably say that the longer 25 to 30 line length poems maybe aren't Insta poems. And I would say that the shorter lengths probably more so qualify within that genre.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Because when you ask me just, point blank, how long do you think an Insta poem should be? My very first thought is no more than 10 lines. Anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, there's a third thing, but I would definitely see it more as a trope than a defining feature, which is the content of the poetry. I often find it leans more into either trauma or self-empowerment or both combined. But I think there's enough examples of famous Insta poets writing outside of that topic or those two topics to where I do think it's more of a trend or a trope of the genre rather than a necessity.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that too. The definition I pulled is multifaceted. I looked to Wikipedia and then to a video from a YouTuber named Newly Nova, who did a real deep dive into Rupi Kaur and Instapoetry as a form. So, regarding themes and topic, Wikipedia says that the themes are usually commonplace, and I would agree. I also wrote down trauma as being one of the major themes that's touched on with Instapoetry. I also wrote down love and relationships and family ties, but self-empowerment, I hadn't written that down, and I think that's a good one to include as well. And I mean, when it comes to poetry in general, I would say those are not uncommon, right? Writing about trauma, family ties, self-empowerment, love and relationships. And so I think it makes sense that Insta poetry would go that route. It's like when you're in high school, you kind of get the impression that all poetry is either about love or death. If you're approaching poetry for the first time, right, you're probably going to think it's a vehicle to talk about love or trauma. I would also add accessibility, simplicity, a basic use of vocabulary, which I don't know, that might be hard for the two of us, and then a pedestrian free verse style with a confessional tone. And just as you have already stated, the poems are designed to be reposted.
I was also thinking about other very short form types of literature and poetry. So thinking about haiku and 6 word stories. For example, if I were to tape for sale baby shoes never worn and put indents into it, would you consider that an Insta poem?
I kind of think I would, yeah. Like, it might kind of technically have more depth than the average Insta poem because it's not so explicitly saying exactly what it means. But at the same time, I kind of would classify that as an Insta poem. I don't know. What do you think?
I think I agree. Because also, I think, at least the better Instapoems that I've seen use some sort of like poetic device, even if the poetic device is more on the nose and you don't necessarily have to read it a ton of times to understand it. So I would say that imagery is being used in that 6-word story in a way that like has meaning but is also pretty instantly understandable, I think.
For me, it raises the question, how explicit, how obvious do we want these poems to be? Because oftentimes I feel like the more obvious the meaning, the less it resonates actually.
I really associate Instapoetry with obvious language, even though that is in direct kind of opposition to like what I tend to lean towards and in the poetry that I read and write. That probably should be something that we aim for is like more instantly graspable language and vocabulary. But then the question becomes what would make a good Instapoem? Because the things that I usually value in poetry are kind of off the table. Maybe we should do some brainstorming, like related to that, positive qualities that we can pinpoint that also have to do with like Instapoetry.
I don't think I would classify this as an Instapoem necessarily, but have you read The Two-Headed Calf by Laura Gilpin? So that's a really short poem, and it's one that really gets at its message kind of obviously, and yet I do still classify it as a poem because it's using this unique symbol of the two-headed calf, something that I haven't read before in any other poem, right? And so it kind of still stands for that reason. Similar to your question about the 6-sentence story, would you classify that as an Instapoem? Do you think that counts?
I think so. I'm trying to imagine if I saw it in a book of Instapoetry, would I just be like, "Whoa, that doesn't fit at all?" It's a bit of a stretch, but I think so.
Okay, that opens the gate a little bit for me because if that's the case, then I'll probably try to rely more on symbolism. And you had mentioned, that Instapoets do use poetic devices, not always, but sometimes, no matter how shallow they might appear. In that case, that would probably be what I would go to if I'm trying to make meaning that's both simplistic while still being impactful. I would probably try to rely on symbols, metaphors, and similes. What do you think? What other good tropes of the genre do you identify?
How the poem sounds isn't necessarily something I associate with Instapoetry, but it's also not something that disqualifies a poem from being Instapoetry. So that's maybe also something that I might try to lean into to have more of a positive effect on the reader, just looking at not like strict rhyming structures, but just the rhythm and like the sound of the work when it's read aloud. I think it's difficult enough.
Yeah.
I think the challenge itself is like it's pretty hard for me. You probably agree. Trying to write in a genre that is feels so like diametrically opposed to like what naturally comes to you. So yeah, I'll do my best.
Okay, I have my computer out in front of me and I'm ready to make some hopefully tolerable Instapoetry. I think I did a pretty good job of appearing nonchalant on that Zoom call, but this is the Roughest Drafts collab. He's kind of the poetry guy on YouTube. So we gotta pull out all the stops. We gotta lock in. This is gonna be good. So I have the requirements listed at the top of the document here, and I'm actually thinking of a few different ways to get inspiration for this challenge. One approach I'm thinking of is to really focus in on the volta and try to create some sort of interesting turn within these few amount of lines. If I can't have complex or overly surprising figurative language, then I'm gonna be looking for other ways to interest or surprise the reader, other ways to make the poem memorable, and I think that maybe could be achieved through an interesting shift from the start of the poem to the end, especially if it's so concentrated within only 10 or less lines. I kind of like the idea of having a phrase that is said at the beginning of the poem and then repeated at the end, but the meaning completely changes because of the added context. And what if I used a good old-fashioned homophone to make this repetition a little bit more interesting? Let me show you what I mean. So if the first line of the poem is "How I dread the morning," the last line could be "How I dread the morning," as in grief. And the poem can document this shift in the speaker's perspective from this beginning phrase to the end one. It could be a poem about how your perspective changes as you age, and so maybe there are things that the speaker is complaining about related to the morning that in the future they will actually mourn. So what if I change this first line to "How I dread the busy morning"? We can have simple images of the speaker being irked by how hectic life is, and this will set me up for the volta that I want to do. The loud traffic and ridiculous lines just to grab coffee with a friend. I get annoyed at her for leaving early. I'm trying to keep the vocab incredibly simple. Now I want to switch to a scene later on where the speaker is missing how active, how involved they were in life, and now they're just kind of watching from afar, passively. So I'm thinking something like this. So besides wanting to show that contrast of someone who used to be actively participating and is now a passive observer, I also want to show the contrast here of how the speaker passes her time. Instead of going out to get a coffee with a friend, she is simply just counting people from her windowsill. That's how bored she is and how unable she is to even do the things that she wants to do. I could do a slight wordplay here with the numbers and her counting people, and I could say, I'll wish I was 21 again. Typically, I don't go for repetition, but I think the repetition of again works here to emphasize that monotony. I think it needs one more line before the final one because it's clear she's mourning her youth, but I think it could be more impactful to reference that friend again. Could write, I'll reach for her name. So this implies a forgetfulness as you age, but to make that line a little bit more interesting, I want to give the name some sort of descriptor. I like this. Rope is a very common symbol to represent being grounded, but we're going for common but hopefully effective symbols here. And then I'm gonna slightly tweak the last line to put even more contrast on this repetition. How I dread the lull of morning in contrast with how I dread the busy morning. I'm just gonna go through and do some essential tweaks. You know what time it is. Can't have an Instapoem without the ampersand. And that is the draft of my first attempt at an Instapoem. My second idea of how to approach this is to create a poem that is aware of its own simple and perhaps cliche construction in order to justify that construction. It's essentially to make the simplicity and maybe even the shallowness of the poem part of the point, because it somehow parallels the topic that the poem is discussing. This is a classic poet technique. I'm aware of it, I'm calling attention to it, and so it can't be a mistake. This would probably end up leaning in like an ironic Ars Poetica sort of direction, but not necessarily. I can't really say until I make it. None of us will know what this will look like until I write it. So I'm going to challenge myself with making this one about love and dating, since that, as we discussed, is a common trope. So I have this idea of social performance on a date, trying to present yourself in a way that makes it easy for others to understand you and not judge you. And I can compare this to the construction of a very simple, easily digestible stanza of poetry. You can title it First Date. Very simple, straightforward title. The first line I'm thinking could be, I recite my dialogue like a little stanza. Once again, I'll be looking for opportunities to use wordplay, assonance, consonants, to make the poem more interesting and try to make up for the lack of complexity in the poem. Our tools are limited, okay? So we got to use the ones at our disposal. I like the idea of comparing it to a dress rehearsal because you get dressed up for a date, and that's also very much part of your presentation and performance, especially as a woman. But it would be a bit more interesting to change it to dress rehearsed and really draw more attention to that comparison. What you're wearing, your dress, is also a rehearsal and a performance of your femininity if you're speaking about a woman's perspective. And then to expand on this comparison, I want to focus on what a simple stanza might be comprised of. If I compare the act of intentionally placing commas in a stanza to the intentional placement of laughter in conversation, this not only emphasizes the performative feeling of small talk and first dates, but it also plays on the age-old expectation of, as women, just laugh on command at someone else's jokes and that will make you likable. Now would be the time to bring in some sort of imagery. And y'all who watch my channel know I love me some imagery. I think it would be interesting to lean into the cycle of it all. Like if the speaker feels almost trapped in this pattern of performance for romantic partners. So now we've set up the image of them meticulously planning out how they are going to present themselves the night before a date. And we can use some symbols for cyclical time. So birds welcoming dawn, classic, and we can bring it back to the original comparison that the whole poem is based on. Cliche lines that I can never stop starting and never stop startling me from sleep. I think this language is simple enough, but I'm curious to see what Jonah thinks and if he thinks it will qualify as an Instapoem. But yeah, this is my second attempt at writing a good Instapoem. And then my final idea is to take a draft of a poem that I've already written and try to zero in on one moment, kind of create this simplified clipping of the original poem that still maintains, hopefully, some of the meaning and intrigue of the piece. Looking through my drafts, I thought it would be fun to try to work with this one. It's more just whimsical and silly, and we have seen some silly Instapoems. Okay, Gabby, Hannah, I'm looking at you. For this full poem, when I wrote it, I was just mainly thinking of it as an exploration of perspective. I essentially just took a bunch of phrases and tried to flip their point of view so that the speaker of the poem just has this warped sort of view of reality, often a victim mindset, blaming other people. I definitely think the riddle quality of this poem doesn't work for an Instapoem, because we can't have people being confused. You know, that's the last thing we can have in an Instapoem. But if I were to take these 4 lines and make it abundantly clear which phrase I'm talking about, I could even make the title 2 Birds, 1 Stone. We could maybe turn this into something that is much more focused. If I add this line here, it makes it clear that the narrator is untrustworthy. I mean, they're blaming baby birds. So this one's definitely shaping up to be a more experimental take on the Instapoem, but that's why we have 3 different attempts. Okay, the first one was the safest. So the amount that I add to this little clipping of the poem is dependent on how much I want the poem to be grounded by a specific scenario. Since Instapoems tend to lean more generalized, I think I might just add this line at the end. It leans more satirical, but it also ties it back to the harm ambition without empathy can inflict, and that can be kind of the general message of the poem. And you can read it where you take what the speaker is saying at face value, or you can read it as the poem's making fun of the speaker's self-victimization, which hopefully makes the poem a bit more interesting. So there you have it. I have my 3 Instapoem drafts, and I'm excited to see what Jonah has created and what he'll say about these.
So Danae has tasked me with writing 3 Instapoems. They cannot be longer than 8 lines. There has to be at least 1 poetic device, but it should still be instantly understandable. And she's asked me to lean into the general topics and content that you see in Instapoems, that being love, trauma, and self-empowerment. So this is going to be difficult for a number of reasons. For one thing, personally, I'm just kind of a very verbose writer, especially in my first drafts when I feel there's less pressure to create something excellent. I'm quite wordy, and then it's in the editing process where I try to break things down a little further. I've gotten a lot better at that over the years. I've gotten better at editing as I write instead of leaving it all to a later editing session. But even still, constraining myself to only 8 lines, it's kind of tough. It's kind of tough for me. And to that point, this is also going to be difficult because beyond just being verbose, I kind of favor a longer line in poetry. And Instapoem lines are usually very short, like anywhere from 1 to maybe like 10 words maximum, and usually a lot less than that. But this is also going to be difficult because it needs to be easily understandable while still containing a poetic device. And for me, I am really tempted to use a poetic device and then let the reader interpret what it's supposed to mean. That, I think, would make for a really effective short poem. But in an Instapoem, I feel like a simile needs to explain itself so as to not be misinterpreted. Those are just a couple of reasons that this is going to be challenging, but we're going to give it our best shot. So let's start with trauma. I already kind of have an idea in mind. This morning I made hard-boiled eggs, but one of them, as it turned out, was actually already a little bit cracked. As a result, it had like that growth. So I thought we could use that as an effective simile to talk about trauma, maybe. I was an egg. You wanted to hard boil me, but you had already cracked me. And we'll title that one Parental Pressure. And we'll put it in italics because that's what Instapoets do. Beautiful. We can streamline that. Let's make that even shorter. Yeah, let's just get rid of the word had, right? Let's say years ago. I think that makes the title land all the better. Yeah, that has a fine sound to it. Fine enough, right? Parental pressure, there's an okay alliteration to that, I guess. But I actually think I might favor parental expectations. I'm tempted to title it Great Expectations, but I think the context of parentage is necessary there. All right, let's do one about love. We did a metaphor on the last piece. What if we did some personification here? Do Instapoets even use personification that much? Or is it kind of just similes and metaphors for them? What would Atticus write here? Something like really cliche, right? What's a cliche love symbol? A rose? Let's make it like a matter of happenstance. I found a rose on the sidewalk. We're going to favor a longer line in this poem. Longer, relatively speaking, for Instapoetry conventions. I picked it up and it said to me, "Do you know what it feels like to be abandoned?" And we'll go ahead and put all that in italics. And while I felt for her, I felt luck more than anything. The luck to say, no, I don't. What should the title be there? The first thing that comes to mind is just like love everlasting. I'm torn because like I do want these to be good, but at the same time, it's like I already have a little bit of a defeatist attitude here where it's like, how good can these be? Oh, we should italicize that last line too. I'm going to change this line so it's a little clearer. A luck that allowed me to say. That's clunkier, and yet it, I think, accomplishes more what I'm actually trying to do there. I think it also implies what I mean here, which is that the speaker feels lucky to have a love everlasting. They feel lucky that they haven't been abandoned, and they probably feel like they never will be. Allowed me is too verbose. A luck that let me say, no, I don't. This is just not what I come to poetry for. This is not what I look for when I read poetry. And so every sense in my body is saying, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. I don't know. There's just nothing I can really do, I guess. This is embarrassing too, because I don't want Danae to think I'm a bad poet in general. Okay, we'll write one more poem about self-empowerment. Let's do a biblical allusion in this poem. Okay, a biblical allusion in a poem about self-empowerment. Yeah, wasn't there a whole thing about Moses feeling like a bad speaker? Okay, let's try something. Moses, slow of speech, but commanded a nation. How is it this hard to think of someone from the Bible? How about Samson, seduced by man, but brought down the temple. Eve, tempted by the serpent. But I have a line in mind, but I'm worried it's too artsy for an Instapoem. Prometheus of knowledge. Like, is that too academic? Is that allusion too insular? And I'm kind of double dipping in allusions there because I'm going from biblical to Greek mythology. I'm just going to say, whatever, man. Last two lines. Poet, poor and starving. That feels too synonymous. How about sad and starving? Container of multitudes. A little Walt Whitman allusion there. And yet that also feels too academic. I'm also going to change these. Moses, slow of speech, but commander of a nation. Samson, seduced by man, but how do I turn that into a title instead of a verb? Collapser, that sounds too weird. Collapser, I hardly know her. How about destroyer? Destroyer of the temple. Poet, sad and starving, but container of multitudes. Yeah, I'm worried that ending is a little too poetic. It's not clear enough. It's not on the nose enough. Poet, sad and starving, but shaker? Quaker? Yeah, let's do Quaker. Quaker of the earth. That seems clear enough, right? Even though it is still poetic-ish. I am still a little worried about the Prometheus line. Let's call it weakness. So we've got our three poems. They are, in my mind, not great. I don't know. I don't know if they could be, given what it is I'm trying to achieve here. I don't know. I'll have to wait to hear what Danae has to say, and I'll have to wait to hear what you all have to say. That's fine. It's all fine. Oh boy. All right. I'm gonna be honest. I felt embarrassed about my showing after reading your poems.
I think you very much like leaned into the challenge though. I feel like part of the issue with some of mine is like I mean, I'm curious to hear what you think, but one of them in particular, I don't know if it really like qualifies or if it's like straightforward enough.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. Okay, so my first piece reads, I was an egg, you wanted to hard boil me, but you cracked me years ago. Parental expectations.
So this one I interpreted to mean that the speaker is talking about their parents' approach to parenting and how they kind of had these very tough expectations on them. And they wanted these expectations to make them a tougher person, but instead it like emotionally broke them. First of all, I have to commend you with how short this is. It's only, I think, 16 words. And I think it very much like conveys the metaphor that you're going for. I like the comparison that you're making of the egg and the fact that it is all like the entire poem is concentrated in this one metaphor, very much giving insta poetry, but I like the metaphor. I think my only note would be I think it would benefit maybe from even just an additional line that might specify how the process of boiling this egg would lead to it being cracked. Because right now it's like both of the pieces of the metaphor are existing in the idea of cooking with an egg, but I don't necessarily think of boiling an egg as like being at risk of cracking it. And I think what you're trying to convey is that like the process of parenting resulted in the cracking of this metaphorical egg. So even if it's just like, did they throw it in the boiling water and then it like cracked on the bottom of the pot or something like that? Something that ties that a little bit more seamlessly together. But other than that, I think it's very effective and condensed, which is what we're going for.
I agree with you, absolutely. More than anything, I just wanted to explore this visual and this metaphor. Maybe this will come as no surprise to you, but like, I'm not satisfied with this in its current state. I would much rather explore that metaphor with more room to breathe.
I mean, so goes insta poetry.
Right. Exactly. I think your interpretation absolutely makes sense, and I think your critique is completely valid too. That's a critique that still kind of, I don't know, maintains the integrity of the Instapoem format.
I think it's meant to be in that one metaphor. Like I think that really works for the genre, but still is effective.
All right, should we move on to your first one?
How I dread the busy morning, the loud traffic and ridiculous lines, just to grab coffee with a friend. I get annoyed at her for leaving early. One day I'll count people from my window, lose my place and start again. I'll wish I was 21 again. I'll reach for the tethering of her name. How I dread the lull of morning. Perspective.
I'll give some overall thoughts before I jump into this piece in particular. I kind of love all of your pieces that you wrote here. These read like Danae Younge poems, which I genuinely think is impressive that you can, maintain your voice while kind of constraining yourself in this way. But therein kind of lies the issue. They read too much like poetry and not enough like insta poetry. That being said, I think this first piece, Perspective, this is kind of the most insta poetry-ish of the three, in my opinion, in the sense that it's the most digestible and understandable and relatable. I adore the sound on this piece. I know that was something you had mentioned you wanted to kind of tackle going into this, and I thought you nailed it. The subtle rhymes woven throughout, really nice. I love in the first line, busy morning, versus the last lines, lull of morning. And lull is such an interesting word there. I love that word choice. Also the word tethering, love that word choice too. And then going from line 4 to 5, really fascinating shift. The idea of counting people from the window is such a concrete idea, and such an effective way to place the reader. I like that a lot too. I'm not totally sure about the repeated use of the word again in those subsequent lines. I do like the sound of it, but like, I think there is potentially another way to phrase it to avoid that sameness, you know?
I thought you might say that. Just from watching your videos, I know you're not a fan of repetition.
But as far as Instapoetry goes, like I said, this one's the most digestible, and yet I wonder if it's like too meaty. I don't know that I would come across this poem in the wild and categorize it as an Instapoem. I think it still reads as like just slightly too deep. It's hard to characterize and classify any of this because it's like, where is the line between an insta poem versus a short poem that still has depth to it? As for what I would change, I think if you were an insta poet and if you were trying to, you know, put this poem in a collection, it could go in as is, or you could divide it into maybe two different poems. Because I like I said, I love the shift between the two settings, but I think if you were an Insta poet, you would probably just take those individual settings and make them each their own poem.
Take away the Volta. Can't be there.
Back to my piece. I found a rose on the sidewalk. I picked it up, and it said to me, "Do you know what it feels like to be abandoned?" And while I felt for her, I felt luck more than anything. A luck that let me say, no, I don't. Love everlasting.
So the way that I interpret this poem is that the speaker is kind of using this anthropomorphized rose to reflect on the fact that they're lucky to have never experienced abandonment. Well, first of all, I have to say thank you for using italics intentionally. Instapoets, you can take notes on that. Please don't just italicize random phrases. In this case, it indicates dialogue, obviously. The like personification of the rose is interesting. It's surprising, but it's very simple. I think really the only note that I have is actually that the second to last line I don't think needs to be there. And I don't even think that that's necessarily because of that, like, I lean towards more implication in poetry. I think that the third to last line says all you need to say about like how the speaker feels. So if you just had like, I felt luck more than anything, period, and then in italics, no, I don't, as a response, I think that that might get across the same exact sort of sentiment. And if you wanted it to be like even more clear, I think maybe you could have like a colon or like an ellipsis at the end of that line to like indicate that they're connected.
I think you're absolutely right. I'll confess, I actually kind of struggled with that line. The first draft of it was a lot clunkier, but even as it exists now, a luck that let me say, I agree. I completely agree that it's not necessary.
Honestly, I feel like this might be my favorite in terms of like accomplishing the challenge of still being an insta poem, but I just really like the rose like talking back. I think that's surprising and like makes the poem interesting.
Much like the first poem, it's something I would rather expand upon in a longer piece. First date.
Yeah. I recite my dialogue like a little stanza. Dress rehearsed. Each laugh like a comma I have placed and rearranged in the night. Before the birds open their beaks, like cliche lines I can never stop starting and never stop startling me from sleep. First date.
Oh, so that's supposed to be startling in the last line?
Oh, yes.
Oh.
It's a little typo.
The use of the word starling was what I actually kind of found most interesting. I thought you were.
You gotta scratch that.
That's right. It's too interesting. You gotta change it because I thought you were carrying on with, you know, the bird motif. Yeah. And then, of course, never stop starting as a little oxymoron. That's fun. The title at the bottom of the poem, which is something I normally rather dislike, I actually found it quite effective here. I thought, like any good title, it reframes what I had read, and I think sometimes that's kind of the most you can ask for from a title. And then again, I do wonder if this is too poetic, and it is ultimately with the birds where I think that is the case. Like the phrase, before the birds opened their beaks, that's such a striking phrase and image, and one that I am not sure I would ever find in an Instapoem.
I actually originally considered writing like a specific type of bird. Like I was gonna write the thrushes, because usually thrushes like welcome dawn. And then I was like, no, that birds, we gotta stick with birds. Like we can't be specific here. But yeah, I definitely think out of the three, This one I probably didn't do as much of a good job as like at staying inside of the like boundaries of Instapoetry. Got a little excited in the middle of it. But yeah, I think maybe if I tried to keep a little bit of more of the same of the first half of the poem and continue that on, then it might read more like an Instapoem.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I don't know. In my initial notes, I had said that your first poem, Perspective, was maybe the most Instapoetry-ish, but this one maybe is even more digestible once you read the title. And like I said, I like the surprise of that title, you know? The image of the birds still sounds poetic, and so I think it like actually still kind of captures what people come to Instapoetry for, where it's easy to read and easy to understand, and yet it still seems poetic.
With the title, it's really interesting because I never write titles at the end, and actually I thought of the title like as one of the first things. So I was writing it with the title at the start for the entire poem. And then I think when I decided that like, okay, all Insta poems pretty much have titles at the bottom, I was like, okay, now it feels a little bit too like with the title at the start, it feels more on the nose because the entire time you're reading it, you know what it's about. Maybe that could be something, although it kind of betrays the style of Insta poetry, that would make it feel more instantly accessible in meaning.
I do wonder though, like maybe there is actually something to this idea of putting the title at the bottom. I don't typically like the way Instapoets do that because I think the way they do it is like most aspects of Instapoetry, it's kind of like obvious. And that's not to say it has to be a surprise either, but maybe there is an artsy, poetic, interesting way to title the poem at the bottom instead of at the top. Okay, last one from me. Moses, slow of speech, but commander of a nation. Samson, seduced by man, but destroyer of the temple. Eve, tempted by the serpent, but Prometheus of knowledge. Poet, sad and starving, but Quaker of the earth. Weakness.
This one's really interesting. I like the concept of it and like the little snapshot couplets that you have. I interpreted it as like a reflection on these different biblical figures and then also like the role of the poet and how weakness is perceived, but that's not necessarily an indication of the impact that someone can have. And that's kind of the contrast I see you wanting to make with those two lines of each couplet. I really like, as I said, the concept of it. And I like that it comes back to poets. I think the only note I would have is I feel like out of all of those two line groupings, the first one to me is the best at showing a clear contrast between the first line and the second line in terms of like, okay, this one descriptor for this person isn't necessarily something you would also group with the second thing. Because when we think of like commanders and leaders, we often associate that with speeches and being able to inspire people with your words. And I think a way could maybe be improved is looking at those descriptions of the other people and trying to make a clearer contrast. For example, the poet who is sad to be like the Quaker of the earth. If you said like the poet is reclusive and like hidden away or something like that, then maybe you wouldn't expect them to then influence like the entire world who they barely interact with.
Despite the brevity and the simplicity, I did have a hard time. Like the Moses line was what came to me first, and then coming up with the subsequent lines proved a little harder than expected. But I absolutely see what you're saying, where that first couplet does have a more stark contrast to the other two, but also like a logical through line.
What inspired that last one, or like what did you think of first before you constructed it?
I think I was really just trying to channel Rupi Kaur and imagine like, okay, what would Kaur say about poets, or how would she, you know, potentially write about herself as a poet? Does that even come through?
I think it comes through. It makes even more sense when you say that, because also I feel like the placement of like the poet on the same level as like the biblical figure is very much like self-aggrandizing. I do think that makes sense in the context of like what you were thinking about.
All right, back to you.
You killed my stone with your birds, your cruel baby robins. I cried over its limp body, had a funeral. 100 pebbles came and you didn't even think to show. So goes the plight of being ambitious. Two birds, one stone.
It's a killer poem, no pun intended. The phrase limp body is doing a lot of the heavy lifting for me. I like that phrase a lot, the idea that a stone could have a limp body. And then, despite being the shortest, this one was actually kind of the least Instapoetry-esque to me. I can't say I typically see Instapoetry employing conceits like this one, and not this well. You really force the reader to linger and wonder exactly what the stone represents, and you've inverted the cliche, which I think is pretty common among Instapoets and even among like lyricists, songwriters, but you've done it really artfully, and I don't know that this one can quite be so instantly absorbed as the other two. A reader has to sit with it and wonder who the you is in the piece along with the metaphor, and I would assume it's like a lover, a scorned lover maybe, but I can't say for sure, and I like that I can't say for sure. I like that there's so much room for interpretation.
So a little bit of insight into my process with this one. I took a draft of a longer poem and tried to make it into an Instapoem. So I thought maybe I could simplify it, like make it abundantly clear which phrase I'm talking about, and then try to make it more of like a broad commentary on like ambition. But I definitely agree that it's too weird. I don't even know if I could change it per se, because like the whole concept of it is not fitting within like the Instapoetry genre.
Yeah, I feel like Instapoetry is a lot more explicit, of course. If it presents a metaphor, it kind of feels the need to explain it. If we were to make this like full Instapoem, if you were to just change the title to a very brief explanation of the metaphor, then that would still work. But I love how weird it is. I love weird poetry.
How do you think we did on this challenge?
I don't know. The challenge was to make the poem digestible, but also still attempt to make it resonate with a reader and say something profound. Yeah, I don't know. I personally had a really hard time trying to make them good while still making them what they are. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, same. I think I prioritized it being like good, and then and fitting into like the Instapoetry category was like the second priority, and then you kind of like flipped it. So we balanced each other out.
Thank goodness. At least the viewers of this video will get some good poetry. I will ask though, did you learn anything from this exercise?
I mean, I honestly think it made me like think more about short poetry. I'm gonna be honest, I don't really feel like I focus that much on length when I'm writing a poem. It just like I write it and it ends up being the length that it is. But I kind of like really thinking about how much you can say with a short amount of words. So maybe this could open up some more opportunities to try to actively make shorter poems, maybe not Instapoems, but like shorter poems, and focusing on how much weight like an individual word can have. What about you?
I would agree. I don't tend to worry about the length as I'm writing. I'm a believer that a poem finds its form as you write and revise it. Unless I'm working with like a specific form, like a villanelle or a haiku or a sonnet, I don't really worry about the length, not of the lines nor of the poem itself. Yeah, it was really difficult, not only trying to make the poem good, but also just how can I make this poem like as short as possible while still conveying exactly what I want to convey. And I do think there is value in asking that question.
Well, I think we did a good job. Curious to see what the comments think.
And indeed, viewers, it's your turn to tell us what you think. Did we do a good job? Was this exercise all for naught? Do you think it's possible to write an Instapoem on par with what's traditionally considered good poetry? Can you think of any examples? Please tell me everything. Huge thanks to Danae for working on this video with me. Go subscribe to her channel if you haven't already. If you like my stuff, you'll love hers. I also want to give an enormous thanks to my patrons for their continued support. If you want to support the channel or Danae's, you can subscribe to our Patreons. On my end, for just $3 a month, you get to see videos early, hear about the books I'm reading each month, and receive access to the community Discord where we do prompts and open mics in voice chat. To support in other important ways, all of the algorithm stuff really helps a lot. Liking, commenting, subscribing, hyping, killing stones with birds, etc. You can follow me on my socials if you want, but no matter what, keep reading, keep writing, and ultimately keep in mind, this is a rough draft. And for sticking around till the end, you get a writing prompt. And today it's going to be the same prompt that I had. Write a poem of no more than 8 lines that deals with love, trauma, or self-empowerment. The poem has to use at least one poetic device, but it still has to be instantly understandable and or easily digestible. It's your turn now. Get to writing.